Hi, I'm Danny, and this feels like it's going to be a horribly long video, but it's going to be on competition policy and contestable markets. Imperfect markets, so markets that contain monopolies or oligopolies, tend to be considered to be productively or allocatively inefficient because they're not necessarily reducing their costs to the lowest possible level and that sort of thing. Technically, this might not be true because monopolistic firms and oligopolistic firms tend to be more dynamically efficient than those in perfect competition, but for a lot of people we see imperfect competition as not the ideal, which is why the government has competition policy in place, which is basically a series of methods used by the UK government and EU authorities in order to increase market efficiency, which covers a range of things. You can see there: monopolies, mergers, promotion of new competition, and restrictive trade practices. Restrictive trade practices are basically methods that firms use to try to reduce competition or reinforce their dominance. For example, discriminatory prices, so if you offer a discount so buyers will purchase lots of products, because that will keep them at your brand, not allow them to stray to other areas. Resale price maintenance, which is when your selling price is basically fixed to prevent any price competition, and you can refuse to sell your goods or services to retailers that don't agree to this RPM, retail price maintenance. And finally, full-time forcing, so any firms that wish to sell the product of this monopoly or oligopoly will have to stock the entire range. You won't let them stock just one or two products, they have to stock the whole range, which basically increases the sort of viewing that your products are going to get, because customers won't just see one or two of your products, they'll see your whole range, and especially if you're taking up shelf space even that could be taken up by other brands, you're going to basically increase your dominance there. The Department of Trade and Industry is basically the government department responsible for British industry, and it's reported to by the two big sort of areas on the screen here, so the Office of Fair Trading and Competition Commission. Hope you can read the writing there, because I am struggling. The Office of Fair Trading is basically the government organisation responsible for implementing aspects of competition policy. Monitors a lot of things, as you can see there on the screen: concentration ratio, which we looked at in the last video, evidence of price discrimination or leadership, merger takeover activity, because obviously that leads to a risk of monopolies or dominant firms, which might be bad for the consumer, ratios of advertising expenditure to sales, so no large firm can benefit from having massive profits by advertising more to wipe out the rest of the competition, profit margins, and the ratio of capital employed to sales turnover. If firms are found to exploit their dominant market position against the public interest, they're basically reported to the Competition Commission and they could be broken up. So the Competition Commission here is responsible for implementing policies related to monopoly, and they've got lots of ways they can deal with monopoly abuse. They can break up the monopoly, they can put price controls in place, tax excessive profits, nationalisation, which is state control of firms, privatisation, which is when they sell government assets to the private sector, or deregulation, which can encourage more competition to enter the market. Competition Commission basically outlaws the abuse of dominant market position. We count this as about 40% plus market share, and it means that monopolies can't restrict output to generate supernormal profits. We want monopolies to be acting in the public interest. So why might nationalisation take place? Well, the first reason is economies of scale. For some industries, the MES occurs at a very, very high output, and if we had a contestable market and lots of firms producing output, costs would be a lot higher because none of the firms would be able to reach their MES. Whereas if we've got one nationalised sort of industry, we often have lower costs of production, which is better for the consumers and just better in general in terms of economic welfare and well-being. Natural monopoly is when firms can gain continuous economies of scale. We spoke about natural monopoly when we did monopoly, so I'm not going to go all over that again. The final reason is provision. Basically, it ensures the provision of some necessary low-profit products. For example, public goods could be a big one there. If the government doesn't supply public goods, then they're not going to be supplied on the sort of competitive market because there's no profit to be made from them. There's lots of different forms of privatisation, so one of them is deregulation, which is the removal of restrictions on the provision of goods or services. So if you had very intense regulation, this could potentially restrict competition, although particularly in the banking industry, regulation can be very, very, very important there. Next one is the sale of local authority assets, which is when assets are expensive to run and so they're sold. So for example, the government might have previously held certain assets which would be useful in certain industries and it might sell them on. Our local council sold a building the other day. That's a local authority asset which it's sold. Privatisation for you. Next one is competitive service tendering. So it's when we introduce competition into the market for the provision of public services. For example, the council might say, no, we're not going to collect rubbish, so other firms have to come in and collect rubbish, and that encourages competition and the sufficiency and that sort of thing. And the last one is franchising/licensing. I tried to mix them together there. Word blend, which is when different companies work in various regions. So my council might have one person doing something, your council might have someone else doing it. One for that would be bins, actually, because it's really annoying when you go to one area and they've got different colour bins to you. Like, I really want some cool coloured bins, but mine are just really boring colours. In terms of content, we're actually a third of the way through the video. If you hadn't worked it out by now, I do prefer macroeconomics to microeconomics, which is why I'm sort of skating over some of this stuff, because I don't find it nearly as interesting as some of the macroeconomic stuff. Here are some privatisation advantages and disadvantages, bonus 10 points to anyone who recognises the figure there. Advantages. Private firms tend to be more efficient because they've got a greater incentive to be productively efficient and that sort of thing. If they're not being efficient, then they could get forced out of the market, whereas a government, if they're holding a sort of national monopoly, then they've got much less sort of incentive to be efficient because they can simply ensure that no other competition comes in. You can raise short-term government revenue if you're selling off local authority assets. I'm sure our local council made tasty profit from that building they sold near me. More competition coming in if you're privatising, which can break up monopolies and that sort of thing. Don't know if privatising is a word, but it'll do. And the final one is, because we have a sort of capitalistic culture and enterprise culture, we have a lot more innovation if we don't have a sort of big government firm doing things. If we've got lots of small firms coming in, they're much more likely to be innovative. Although if we have broken up monopolies, that might not work out, because monopolies tend to be more innovative because they've got the profits that they can sort of be dynamically efficient, whereas smaller firms, if they're only making normal profits, are much less likely to be dynamically efficient. Disadvantages are restricted output. If you're going to try to make profit, you are going to restrict your output probably. You probably might ignore monopolies, hopefully not. You might ignore externalities, particularly negative externalities, so you don't really care how much pollution you're making, because you might not be so fussed about your carbon footprint, whereas the government, it's got targets, and it's probably going to try to keep externalities as low as possible. We'll look at cost-benefit analysis at some point in the last video, I believe, and that's got a bit more in about externalities and social costs and external costs and that sort of thing. Next one is that some vital loss-making services are closed. So say you're providing a public good, the government's providing a public good, chances are it's not going to be provided on a competitive market. And the last one is reduced investment for the long term. Firms are very, very focused on the short term, so you're much less likely to have sort of long-term benefits of privatisation. Here we see some types of privatisation. So we've got public-private partnership, which is a partnership between the public and private sector in order to provide a public service, for example, contracting out. And then we have private finance initiative, which is a form of PPP. Which is when a private firm takes on the bulk of the work. So basically the government is going to decide on a required service, and they're going to seek bids from loads of different private companies, and then basically they'll choose a private company which they'll choose to build, finance and run the project, which basically allows them to draw on the expertise of private companies, because the government can't do everything themselves. They're not actually don't have that sort of talent in loads of different areas. So definitely PPPs and private finance initiatives are a great way of them reaching maximum efficiency by not doing all of the work themselves, whereas ensuring that it does get done, whereas on a competitive market it might not actually get done. Regulation and deregulation. Regulation is basically rules and controls which restrict market freedoms. There's a few different types of regulation. We have self-regulation and external regulation. Self-regulation is when a group of firms regulate themselves through the use of a professional regulator. And external regulation is when an external agency basically enforces rules and controls. So this helps to reduce negative externalities, deter the abuse of monopoly power and protect consumer rights. In a lot of cases this external regulator could be the government or a government sort of company or regulator company, like we have Ofqual, Ofgem, Ofsted, that sort of thing. They're all government regulators basically. Deregulation is basically removing government control from the market in order to free it up, promoting competition, more efficiency. If we've got more firms, obviously less restriction on output, and we can reduce the risk of regulatory capture, which is when regulatory agencies are influenced by firms, which we might have for self-regulation, or even external regulation could happen. It's a form of government failure as it happens. Reduces any unnecessary costs caused by red tape put in place by the government. So the government might say that firms all have to do this, which raises costs and raises prices and reduces sort of the value of incomes as such. They can buy less. Now we're going to look at the theory of contestable markets. In a contestable market, we've got really high levels of competition, so no one firm has significant market share, and hit and run entry is allowed. We have, I'll define that on the next slide. We've got no barriers to entry or exit, so incumbent firms can't exploit huge MESs and that sort of thing. There's no sunk costs. So basically everyone is going to be making normal profit in the long run. Firms are going to try to maximise their short-run profits by producing where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Firms could produce either homogeneous or heterogeneous goods. Heterogeneous? Sounds cool. Don't know what it is. Well, I know what it is, don't know how it's pronounced. Corey looked it up, can't be bothered. Homogeneous is when all the goods are the same. The hetero one is when they're different. Obviously you can look at sexuality for that one, if you can't remember it. But it's quite straightforward. And then there's perfect knowledge in the market, which obviously restricts incentives for investment, because if you invest and you make all these amazing discoveries for how to produce cheaply, because there's perfect knowledge, everyone else will get that, but you'll be the one that's paid for the investment, which is why contestable markets aren't very dynamically efficient. Some really quick definitions here. Hit and run entry is when firms enter the market because there's supernormal profits available, cream off some of the supernormal profits, and then they exit. So they come in for a very short period of time, which is why it's called hit and run. Goodwill is basically the value of a firm in excess of asset value, so it takes into account its reputation and brand, trade contacts, general expertise, that sort of thing. So when you think of Heinz, if you're looking at the asset value, you're going to just look at the factories and the machines and that sort of thing. You're not going to take into account that Heinz is this massive brand that everyone's heard of for baked beans and ketchup and salad cream and about 50,000 million things. Slight exaggeration there. Here we have a charming diagram which demonstrates why monopolies or oligopolies will always make normal profits in the long run. So say we've got our monopoly in place, obviously they're producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which means they make that joyous profit there of size X. Then the industry becomes contestable, the monopoly is going to fear competition. If they keep their price at that level, where they're making that much profit, then they're not going to be very competitive at all, and other firms could just come and produce a lot cheaper and take away all of their customers. So monopoly will reduce its price from MP, monopoly price, to CP, competitive price, which occurs when the average total cost is equal to average revenue. So the monopoly is only making normal profits, but firms are unable to sort of compete, particularly because they've probably got a higher average total cost unless they're just as big. They're not able to make supernormal profit at all, so they're definitely deterred even from the market. So in the long run, if a monopoly is operating in a contestable market, they will be making normal profits. Very useful diagram there. Monopolies are actually forced to be efficient if they're not producing at the lowest cost level. So if they're not producing at the base of the ATC, then they're not going to be as efficient as they could possibly be, which isn't great for the consumer, who will have higher prices. If we're in a contestable market, new firms are simply going to come in and produce at a more efficient level, which means that they can price their goods more competitively and kick the monopoly out of the industry. Hope you appreciate the diagram down there. Bonus points for anyone who can tell me which properties it is. So hopefully this slide and the previous slide have shown you that a monopoly will have to be competitive and only make normal profits, be very efficient, produce at the lowest possible cost in order to remain in the market in the long run. This is assuming a contestable market here. We're not assuming a monopolistic or oligopolistic market where there are very, very high barriers to entry. We're assuming that new firms are perfectly able to come into the market if supernormal profits are made, which is actually quite unlikely given sunk costs and that sort of thing. Speak of the devil, here we have a list of reasons why contestable markets probably aren't contestable at all. Sunk costs, basically it's impossible to eliminate sunk costs in some industries. Sunk costs, I know we've talked about them before, but it's basically when you come into an industry, say you have to buy a factory, that's a massive cost, and you probably can't make quite that much money back because your factory might not be worth as much when you sell it on. or you might have to buy some machines which you can't use for anything else because facts of production really aren't perfectly mobile and they might not be worth as much when you sell it on. Or you might have to give training or something. Training is definitely something that you can't sell on particularly at all. Technological expertise is the next one. If you're a firm and you've been in the industry for a very long time, you're going to have a better knowledge of industry technology than a new firm coming in, a new entrant. Next one is supply chain. A new entrant is going to take time to establish their place in the supply chain, whereas an old firm has got their place established, might have got deals with suppliers and that sort of thing, which a new firm simply isn't going to be able to get. And the final one is entry barriers. Entry barriers can be extremely difficult to remove, probably always going to be there. We've got a few different types of entry barrier down there. The basic entrant barriers could be economic conditions, competitor reactions, market conditions, government regulations, which are going to be very hard for a new entrant to bypass. Innocent barriers are part of the nature of the industry, so economies of scale and a large MES, minimum efficient scale, are going to be much more challenging for a new entrant who's going to start with smaller levels of output than an original firm that's already been there for a long time, who's going to have a higher level of output and is able to thus take advantage of such things. Next one is strategic barriers, which are deliberate, so they might include a hostile takeover, product differentiation, predatory pricing, limit pricing, creation of brand loyalty, and increased advertising. Pretty sure we've spoken about all of those already, so I'm not going to bore you with the details. We do, however, have some benefits of contestable markets. Obviously, we've got a contestable market, we've already mentioned it. Firms aren't able to raise their prices too high, so that's great for the consumer, particularly because their surplus is going to hopefully be maximised, or at least more maximised than it would have been under a monopoly, or a pure monopoly without the threat of competition. Firms can benefit from economies of scale without increasing consumer price, because firms can still have very high levels of output, which can cut their costs, but because other firms could come in and produce cheaper, if the firm does have any advances or technological advances, they're going to have to cut the costs and therefore cut the prices for consumers as well, which is great news for the consumers. And also, if we've got a contestable market, there's reduced need for government interference, because they'll probably sort themselves out to keep prices low, whereas a monopoly would just keep prices ridiculously high. However, we do have some criticisms of contestable market theory, and this feels a lot like the thing we did on the last slide, to be honest, or the slide before last even. Limited application is basically all the stuff we said on the last slide, like sunk costs, barriers to entries, that sort of thing. Technical knowledge, pretty sure we've already done that. Incumbent patents basically prevent competition on specific goods. I know the one that the AS exam Unit 1 were really keen on were patents on medical goods and new drugs. They were like, is it a monopoly if there's a patent on a new drug? Yes, it is, because no other firm is going to be able to produce that new drug even for the next so-and-so years. Efficient firms might not share the results of their research and development either, so if you've been in the market for a very long time and you've built up sort of strong research links and that sort of thing, it's going to be a massive advantage to you over these new firms. And finally, limit pricing, which is when prices are lowered beyond the original competitive level, so newcomers are unable to compete and they're forced to leave, and then you can put your price straight back up again and continue to make massive profits. The final slide! Woohoo! It's the final countdown! I think I might go and delete that, that's a bit embarrassing. I had to take a moment there to catch my breath, I've been speaking a bit too fast. Here we see the application of the Nash equilibrium to a contestable market. So, say we have a monopoly and a potential new firm may or may not enter. Monopoly's got to decide whether or not to have a high price, so it could leave its price at a sort of low price, but the price that it would have if there was more competition, or it could put up a high price, potential to make massive profit if the new firm doesn't enter. Realistically, the sort of situation that the monopoly is going to end up in is going to be where it has a competitive price. That's the Nash equilibrium for this game. We see it in the corner down there, the bottom right hand corner. So the new firm won't enter and the monopoly will make normal profit. Obviously it's too scared to put its price up in case the new firm does enter. And the new firm won't enter because it believes that the monopoly will have a low price and therefore they're both going to make a loss if it enters. Game theory is definitely a really interesting thing just to slip into any of your essays. Quite quick to draw, to just draw it out really quickly and then just write a bit about it. And it's a nice little theory to slip in there if it's relevant. Don't do it if it's not relevant. I think I've done that before. Not a good idea. That's my celebration of finishing the video. It's a bit pathetic, but yeah, that's the end of all this market nonsense. So next time we're moving on to labour, which might be a bit more exciting. I mean, I find this quite interesting, but I think I much prefer doing labour and inequality and more sort of macroeconomic almost policies. I think they're a bit more interesting. But yeah, see you next time for that. Hope you had a lovely day. Hope everything's going nicely for you. The sun is shining and everything's charming. Bye!